Hello, and welcome once again to the Just and Sinner podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again, as always, on the program today. Just want to give you a reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. So if you have benefited from the things that we do here, we ask that you would consider becoming a regular contributor or giving a one-time gift. You can go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page, and help us out. We really do need your support to continue doing the things that we do here. That includes all of our publishing efforts, as well as our continued podcast, our seminars, and the articles that we publish. So all of the other various things that we do. If you don't know about all of those kinds of things and want to check them out, go to justandsinner.org, and you can find links to all of it there. Okay, we're going to be discussing the topic of the Protestant work ethic today. And this is something that I have considered talking about for quite some time. And it shows up every once in a while in Roman Catholic critiques of Protestantism. And critiques of Protestantism are very often critiques of Martin Luther. And so while Max Weber, who's the one who really came up with this thesis that we'll be talking about here, really criticizes Calvinism or blames Calvinism more than anything else for this, what's called the Protestant work ethic. In your little YouTube video thumbnails, when you get ideas about the Protestant work ethic, you're often going to have Martin Luther's face there, and an arrow pointing to Luther's head saying, blame this guy, for our woes or our issues in society today. So I want to talk a little bit today about what Martin Luther's doctrine of the vocation is, what his view of work is, in light of some of these criticisms that are often heard or geared toward Protestants as a whole in terms of this idea of the Protestant work ethic. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this today, this is something I've thought about for a while, was I had a comment, somebody pointed me to a video from Brian Holdsworth. Brian Holdsworth is a Roman Catholic, and I've seen his channel before, and I've seen a few of his videos, a couple of them that he did on Luther that I didn't think were very good representations personally, but then I saw a couple other videos that I thought were generally pretty helpful on totally unrelated issues. But this video, I think, was very simplistic. It's called Blame the Protestant Work Ethic. Now, I thought about doing this entire video as a response. That I would play little clips of the video and respond to each part. And, as I watched the video again and thought about doing that, the video doesn't really work in that way. Like it's not like there are little claims that you can kind of stop the video and break up and refute all of those claims. It's kind of one coherent argument that's really pretty simple to set forward. So I'm not going to be doing a direct response to that video. I'm not going to be just walking through the video and responding to a number of different claims. I don't even disagree with everything that was in the video. But I'm going to use that really more now as a jumping off point to talk about this topic more generally. So as I watched Brian Holdsworth's video that I was pointed to, it was the same kind of stuff I usually see in these videos. And then in the recommended section on YouTube, I saw a bunch of other videos that looked like about the same kind of thing. And I started watching a lot of those as well. These were the shorter videos. I wasn't watching long lectures on Weber. I think that would be quite different. And as I watched these videos, it wasn't just from Roman Catholics. Some of this is from just random channels on YouTube, channels that talk about economics and all sorts of other things. And almost all of them ended up clearly blaming Martin Luther for what they call the Protestant work ethic. And so the way that this idea has filtered down at a popular level from Weber's work seems to be pretty uniform in the way that it's expressed. And I don't know where it is that people are getting their information from in terms of how this works itself out. Your first thought is like, okay, maybe they're all just kind of reading the Wikipedia article, but I actually read the Wikipedia article and it's way more nuanced and clear than you find in these videos. So I don't know. I don't know what it is that they're repeating. It almost feels like one of those things where somebody makes some kind of claim and then it's passed down on and on and on, and then it shows up in all of these different videos. Just like you get with, for example, the transatlantic accent. Maybe you've heard this before, that the transatlantic accent was something that was just artificially created and taught in prep schools and in cinema, but nobody actually ever naturally spoke like that. That's a myth. It's just not true. And you can actually, there are plenty of studies you can read about the transatlantic accent and where this accent comes from. And while it often was an indication of class divides, it wasn't something that was just made up and that nobody actually actually spoke. So you get these kind of myths that show up regularly, and there's one of those myths that really stands behind what we're going to be talking about today. So, for those of you who are not familiar with this idea of the Protestant work ethic, let me just kind of lay out exactly what this is. Now, this shows up in a book from one of the most influential sociologists. He really helped form the entire field of sociology. It was a German thinker. He also wrote in economics, Max Weber, and Weber is spelled with a W. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism is the name of the book. It was written in 1905, and then it is published in English in 1930. This is a text that, if you've done any sociology courses, you will have run across. I took a intro to sociology class in college. That was the only sociology course I took, and we read portions of Weber there. He's just really one of the major names, almost like a Sigmund Freud in psychology, that he's that influential. As I've been looking into this issue a little bit, it's been a long time since I've read Weber, I realized this would probably actually be a worthwhile study. Like just him in general would be worth looking at in our Makers in the Modern World series as we look at some of the influential thinkers in the Western world and the modern and into the postmodern era. So I want to do a more in-depth study on Weber himself. I think he's an interesting thinker. He's one that's very influential and is worth looking at in more depth. But here I'm not really thinking, I don't want to do so much with Weber. I'm really responding to more the apologetic arguments. So essentially, the argument is that there is this shift in the way that the Western world views labor at the time of the Reformation. And this shift really continues into the modern world, into 20th century capitalist systems. And what the Reformation did, in his perspective, is that it started to speak about work as a calling in and of itself. And so during the medieval period, it was really only those sacred orders, the taking of whether it's you're joining the priesthood, or you're taking a monastic vow, a vow of celibacy, those kinds of things are holy callings. But regular earthly just jobs, things that you're doing to make money, aren't really imbued with this sacredness that those other kinds of jobs are. And with the rise of Protestantism, particularly with Martin Luther, these jobs, these things you were doing to make money or to provide for your family or to hoard wealth for yourself, not that that's something that someone like Luther would be promoting, and Weber recognizes that clearly, that now there is a sense in which work is valued in a way that it was not valued before. And so that leads to the first stage, really, of this prioritization of work, and work in the sense that you are producing things that are going to result in some kind of financial benefit to you. The second part of this, and Weber is really critical of Calvinists. He is critical of Lutherans. He's very critical of Lutherans and their views of asceticism, something I want to look a little bit more into before I speak too much about it. But the majority of what Weber does really is critique Calvinism, and then he critiques pietism. And essentially he says that within the medieval Roman Catholic system, there is a sense in which the assurance of one's faith is grounded in external things. Okay, so the assurance of your faith is grounded in the external church, especially the sacraments. You're looking to those kinds of things as signs of grace. And within Calvinism, you don't really have that in the same way. With the doctrine of predestination, you're not looking so much to all of these kinds of external church orders. You're not looking to sacraments so much, but what you are looking to assure yourself of your salvation is some kind of sign that proves that you are one of the elect. Now, this is an issue that I've talked about plenty of times in my critiques of Calvinism, having come from that background, and I think there is a truth to this introspection that tends to happen within the Calvinistic system in this way. But for Weber, this leads to a focus on work, because if work is a holy calling, And if we need to look for signs of our regeneration within Calvinism, well, work, your job, that is a place where you are expending your energy, where you are doing God's holy will, and therefore it becomes basically a sign of one's regeneration. And so people are working within a Calvinistic system in order to prove something. They're trying to prove their regeneration. They're trying to prove their election. And so in doing that, they start to work more. They start to produce more. And for Weber, another part of this story is that as the reforms start to produce more, they start to make more money. Now, it is seen as sinful to spend that money on luxuries, right? To spend that money on yourself. And so people start then in either giving that money to charity work, or they start to invest that money. And hence the rise of investment, which is an essential part of capitalism. So this leads to the rising wealth within particular families. The other parts of the story include the pietists. He's pretty critical of the pietists. He cites Zinzendorf specifically, and Spener and Arndt, who do come from the Lutheran tradition. But the majority of what Weber is not really doing is critiquing the Lutheran tradition as a whole. What happens within an early American system, and he takes Benjamin Franklin as this example of the Protestant work ethic and how this is viewed, is that there is a process of a kind of secularization. So you have someone like Benjamin Franklin, who he's a deist. He goes to listen to sermons of George Whitefield at some points, I guess, but and he has a lot of Christian friends, but he himself is certainly not a Christian. He has his own version of the Ten Commandments. It's very bizarre if you've ever read it. But people like Benjamin Franklin are holding on to this focus on work that shows up within Calvinism, but the theological ground on which that is built starts to really collapse. But that which has been built on it does not. And so this obsession with hoarding wealth within capitalism and increasing capital is a secularization of a Calvinistic attempt to prove one's salvation, or kind of Calvinistic legalism, you might say. That's basically, in short, that's Weber's argument. And he says this kind of thing doesn't really happen within Roman Catholic countries. Now, it's been challenged plenty. Okay? There have been plenty of authors, economists, sociologists, historians who have challenged Weber's argument. And I'm not an expert in sociology. I'm not an expert in economics. And so I'm not going to go through what all of those critiques might be. But I do want to say a couple things about the history here before I delve into the theological content and what it is that Luther actually does do in terms of work. So in terms of history, when you watch videos like Brian Holdsworth's video, and he's not alone, there are plenty of videos that do the same thing. I think they rely on a couple wrong assumptions, wrong views of history. And the first of those is there is an idealizing of the medieval period. And this is something that I see so often within Roman Catholic apologetic sources, is that there is a view of history which really prizes the Middle Ages above all other periods in history, and speaks of the movement from the medieval world into the modern world in almost entirely negative terms. Now, I have to admit that I've made some of these same arguments in a lot of ways, because I do think that there are a lot of things and a lot of ways in which the modern world is in so many ways formed as a response to the Middle Ages, whether it's affirming the Middle Ages or rejecting the Middle Ages. And so the modern world is really this response to the Middle Ages in so many ways. And I have certainly spoken about things that I see as negative in moving out of the medieval world, specifically a lot of the philosophical assumptions of the medieval period, things dealing with metaphysics, that I think were wrongly discarded by modern philosophy. I'm currently writing another book on this issue that's almost done. So I'm sympathetic to some of the critiques of modernity in a lot of ways, but it's easy to be critical of your own age and the things that affect your own age, and look back on the past with these kind of rose-tinted glasses. Everybody's going to do that, right? This is like what C.S. Lewis says, in the essay on old books, if you've ever read this, where he talks about the benefits of reading old books, which is that's the great thing about reading books from different ages is that like every age has its issues, but the issues of that age aren't going to be the issues of your age. And I think that's very true. And it's a reason to read old books. But it's also a reason why we tend to look back on certain ages in the past and idealize them, because we recognize that there are a lot of things that they did better than we do now. However, if you were to just kind of take yourself and you took a time machine and went back into the 14th century, you'd probably be miserable there, and you'd really miss the modern world in a lot of ways. And so things have not just been in slow decline. There have been certain elements, I think, philosophically that really did begin to decline into the modern world, but that's not the entirety of the modern world. And it's a lot more complicated than that. And so what you often find within these stories about the work ethic that show up in all sorts of polemical videos from Roman Catholics is this idealizing of the medieval period and the idealizing of how it is that, say, the medieval peasant related to their work. The way that Brian Holdsworth speaks about it, he speaks about the prioritization of family. They probably would say that family was the most important thing to them. They probably would say that religion was the most important thing to them. If you were asked the medieval peasant what's most important, and he contrasts this with today, where he says, hey, if you ask somebody today what's most important, they might give you the right answers, right? They might say family, or they might say faith, or they might say all sorts of nice things. They're probably not going to say money. However, what he's going to point out, he's going to say, well, they might say that, but the reality is, like, if you ask the question, where are you actually spending the majority of your time? Most of your time is not at home with your family. Most of your time is not at church. Most of your time is spent in your job. I think that's a very weird way to calculate what's important. Just because you spend a lot of time or more time doing one thing than another thing does not mean it's a more important thing. It just means, that it's like a more necessary thing for your survival. You may be working a lot of hours at your job because you're trying to take care of your family. And so even though you're spending more time at work, you are doing it for the purpose of serving a good outside of that job, which is your family. So I think it's a very odd way to calculate what it is that you find important. Of course, if you are regularly and purposefully neglecting spending holidays with your family because you want to make more money or something, it's like the plot of Jingle All the Way. If you ever watched that Arnold Schwarzenegger movie with young Anakin Skywalker, where the dad is like working on all the time and misses all of his kids' things. It's like a trope that you find in a lot of, especially 1990s movies and TV shows. That's bad. That is a prioritization of work over family. But that doesn't mean that working a full-time job is always a prioritization of work over family, because you may be doing it for the purpose of serving your family. So I think it's odd. But when we're looking at the medieval period, then there is this idea that is repeated over and over again, just like this transatlantic accent thing that you find on a lot of videos online, which is that the average medieval peasant worked far less hours than does the average worker today. And so this gives you this perception that, well, the medieval peasant was spending all of this time in leisure, and there was a prioritization of leisure for the medieval peasant. Now, what does leisure actually mean? A lot of times when you listen to people talk about the blessings of leisure, they're talking about things like reading literature. They're often speaking about taking that leisure time to enjoy the high arts. But what is the medieval peasant doing? They're not reading literature. They don't really have those things that are accessible to them. They're not like enjoying the high arts as you might expect that they could. The fact that we can enjoy the high arts, we have access to great literature, the fact that we have access to so much classical music. You could go on YouTube and watch one of Verdi's great operas for free just because somebody uploaded it there. We have access to all of these cultural products that contain so much beauty and are the things that we probably should value the most, but we don't. But those things were inaccessible. I mean, obviously, opera didn't really exist as an art form in the Middle Ages, but those things weren't really accessible for like the medieval peasant. And those are the kinds of things that I see a lot of the same Roman Catholics that prioritize the Middle Ages also praising at the same time, when the reality is that without the development of technologies that happened within capitalism, we probably would not have access to any of those things in the way that we do. Why is it that YouTube is available? Because there are people that were inspired to innovate because they wanted to make money, and in that search for money, they innovated to such an extent that they have now created this forum whereby we can learn all sorts of things. We can listen to beautiful things. We can see beautiful things really without paying for it at all, which is kind of an amazing thing that I think we too often take for granted. So the medieval peasant spends all this time in leisure. The medieval peasant spends time with their family, and there are way more church services. They go to church all the time. And so the life of the medieval peasant is, they have way more days off during the year. They have like over 100-something days off during the year. And so we work way more than the medieval peasant, and we prioritize things totally differently than the medieval peasant. Okay, that's the mythology that's out there. Is that actually accurate to history? Now, the numbers that you're going to see calculated in terms of averages of when the medieval peasant is working are speaking about one element of their work, which is when it is that they are working on their lord's land, right? So if you're a peasant, you are working somebody else's land. And in response to that working on somebody else's land, they provide you with all sorts of benefits. And so this isn't the kind of arrangement of you work X number of hours, I give you a certain amount of money, but they're allowed to have land. They're allowed to live there and receive all sorts of things, protection, military protection, that kind of stuff. And so we're talking specifically there about the days where they are working the land of their lord. Now, this is farm work, and like farm work, it is seasonal. So you've got seasons, like you've got your harvest where you're going to be working insanely long days, but then especially during the winters, you're really not doing a lot at all. So you have a lot of time off. Well, that sounds great. So they have a lot of time off. Is it like you're just taking summer vacation? You could just kind of hang out, do whatever you feel like? Not at all, because those days are not including one's own land that they live on that they also have to take care of, which was on average about 5 acres. So it's not huge, but it's still a lot to take care of. The average medieval peasant owns animals that they have to take care of. Now, if you've ever lived on a farm, I've never lived on a farm, but I've served 2 congregations that were in rural areas with a lot of farmers, and I live around a lot of farms where I am right now, and I know that those people never really take a break. If you work in agriculture, you don't get to just not feed your animals, right? So there are things that have to be done all the time, every day, and it's a lot more than what you'd have to do in an average home where you're not living on a farm, and those kinds of things are just taken care of. You just buy stuff. So there's all of that work. But then along with that, think about the amount of housework that you have. And I don't think we understand how much work it is to take care of a home without modern conveniences. And so you'd be doing things like repairing fences, at home during the winters. You'd be chopping firewood. This is pretty labor-intensive work. You're chopping down trees, chopping up wood, because you got to keep yourself warm during the winter. You got to make all of your own clothes and then repair all of your own clothes. You have to make your own food every day. And yes, the women tended to do that. Now, this isn't done in such a way that, you're just isolated. And this is one of the things that I've constantly spoken about as one of the negatives of moving into the modern world, is that we have moved away from communal life. So that when you are working in a medieval context, you're not just doing these responsibilities by yourself. You live with your extended family. You have a community. You're doing these things together. So they are communally accomplished acts. But it's not just that it's pure leisure. Okay, so they're still working a lot. And they're working in a lot of ways that, sitting in an office all day, or like I get to, sit in my home office working, and I work a lot of hours. But it's not backbreaking work, and it's all pretty leisurely, compared to what the average medieval peasant would have to do. So I think there's a really wrong understanding of work to say that we've moved from this time where everybody just kind of hung out and had all this free time. We all just celebrated all the time. And yes, you had time off for feast days, but you're still taking care of these other things on the feast days. The second part of that is that there is an assumption of the value of religion within the lives of the average person. Now, the good thing about the medieval period is that religion structurally was infused into everyday life, so that it was not something that was optional. Okay, going to church was not optional. Going to mass was not an optional thing. You had to go because it's part of its communal expectation. It's a communal obligation, and you have certain connections that are made at the church. Also, sorts of events communally happen at the church that aren't just one time you go to one service. And so the church was integrated into the life of the community. Now, that is something that is to be prized. That is something that is a serious loss within the modern world. I don't think the Reformation is what is the cause of that. There are a lot of other factors that are happening that are causing a lot of these issues. But I think the assumption that because it's integrated into everyday life, that meant that one's faith was very meaningful to everybody. And I think that's the impression, at least I get out of Brian Holdsworth's video, is that because a lot of people would have said this was the most important thing to them. And, it probably was the most important thing to them. And not really. I just reading and read preachers from the Middle Ages, and you don't even have to read the Reformers, but read the Reformers. There are plenty of other reformers that even are not, Protestant reformers that recognize these issues. Because a lot of average people don't know basic stories of the Bible. That's part of that's illiteracy and lack of education in the clergy. And Martin Luther talks about how he goes on these visitations to visit churches throughout Saxony in the late 1520s, and he meets clergy that have no idea what the Ten Commandments are. They can't name them. And so there is this vast ignorance of basic biblical truth on behalf of much of the laity as well. So, religion, in a sense, is integrated into their ordinary lives, and that's obviously a very good thing. It's not always so simple as to say this is always a positive, right? Or in that this means a well-meaning, well-understood, deeply intertwined understanding of Christianity. That people are very deeply committed to living Christian lives. And that's not really the case. So again, all of those are just to say we need to be careful about how we speak about things and be balanced in how we're talking about things. When we're looking back at any era, and it's not just the Roman Catholics who do this with the Middle Ages. I see Calvinists do this with the time of the Puritans, and I don't know, I mean, maybe Lutherans do it with 16th century Germany. Being an idealized time. I don't know if I hear that much. I think the 30 Years' War kind of sours people on all of that happens after this. But maybe we do speak some ways about the 17th century as, at least theologically, this kind of idealized era, which is fair enough. But we just have to be careful how we look at history. And that's really, really what I'm saying here, is anytime we're looking at a transition from one age to another, it can be very easy to look at the benefits of that age or look with rose-colored glasses and see things as much better than they actually were. And I think we just need to be honest with that. All right. So that's the first part of what I wanted to talk about here. Quick mention here then of capitalism. And I'm not like an anti-capitalist, but I do want to say that capitalism as such is not directly correlated to Protestantism. And so there is this part of this argument that the Protestant Reformation caused the rise of capitalism that I just don't think works out historically. And what I mean by that is that the rise of capitalism comes from largely economic factors, and it comes largely from sociological factors. I do think that Protestantism as a whole does tend to cultivate innovation and hard work. And I think there are reasons for that, which I'll get into in just a minute here. But it's certainly not solely to blame for the rise of capitalism. The reality is the world is changing in the late Middle Ages. So by the time you get to the Reformation, the medieval world is very different. So if you say, take the beginning of the Middle Ages at around 600, and I know there are all sorts of different dates for the Middle Ages. I tend to think theologically, or ecclesiastically, and so when I think Middle Ages, I think first medieval Pope Gregory, around 600. So that's a pretty convenient date there. But I know the kind of fall of Rome, and it's a bit iffy to figure out when he did. But take 600. So 600 AD to 1500 is a very different world, and things have changed immensely. There are a lot of things that have happened. By the time you get to the late Middle Ages, there are philosophical changes and theological changes. But a couple things have happened that are particularly significant to the rise of capitalism. One is the rise of a merchant class. Now, there was always a merchant class. And so you need merchants. There is trade. Trade is always going on. But merchants were generally viewed within the earlier medieval period with skepticism and suspicion. They were often used like tax collectors are spoken about in the New Testament as these are very greedy people. They're probably all guilty of charging way too much money. They're guilty of usury. They are probably all very, very greedy, but they're kind of a necessity in society. We need to have some trade, so we have the merchants. And by the time you get to about 1300, the language that you see being used about merchants is that it becomes a much more kind of respectable, normal job. And so this merchant class is one that makes a living off of buying and selling. You see the growth of cities. When you have the growth of cities, you need to have more trade, of course, because if you're not living just agriculturally, you need to get food and other things from somewhere. And so there's going to be the rise of these guilds. So people are making different kinds of things. And you get your blacksmiths and weavers and whatever else there might be. The 1300s sees the Black Plague. A lot of people die. What happens when so many people die is that those who are landowners all of a sudden lose a huge amount of their workforce. And so they're not able to produce as much food, which becomes a pretty big problem for them. Now, they have to solve this problem, and so one of the ways that they solve this problem is that they start to expand their land. And you start to see that landowners start to get larger and larger portions of land. And when people are buying out land from somebody else, there are a lot of workers that become displaced. They no longer have the assurances that they had before. And so they have to find other means to make money. Now, this tends to happen first in Florence, which especially during the Renaissance in Florence. So you have in France and Italy a lot of this happening, not just in Protestant countries, and this really precedes the birth of Protestantism as a whole. And so the way that people are surviving and making money is just changing. The feudal system of the medieval period is starting to collapse. That was a very simplified version of this. There are a lot of other factors. Again, I'm not a historian. I'm not a sociologist. But there are a lot of things that are going on. So we can't just say it's Protestants. Now, I will say that I do think that Protestants tended to have a sense of innovation that we don't see among Roman Catholics. I think there are reasons for that do rely on a doctrine of vocation or calling. So let's move then to this other element of this, which is the theological one, which is what exactly does Luther mean when he talks about calling or vocation? Because the way that this is presented in some videos, and I saw this in a few different videos, not from Brian Holdsworth, but these are from some other non-Christian channels, that started to say, well, Luther taught that every individual needs to find meaning in life through finding their own unique calling. And every individual finds their unique calling in their job. And so that is where you find fulfillment. Therefore, you should dedicate yourself totally and wholly to your job. Not at all what Luther's doctrine is, but this is a simplified way that I guess Weber's thesis kind of comes funneled down and shows up on YouTube videos. So let's correct that and say what exactly is Luther's doctrine of vocation. Now, if you want to explore this, this book is the best on the topic. It's called Luther on Vocation. It's by Gustav Wingren. And Wingren was a Swedish Lutheran, really great book. Can't recommend all of his work, but some of it is very good. But this book is an overview of Luther's doctrine of vocation that shows up throughout Luther's writings. Now, if you want to read about vocation within Luther's writings, there's not. This is often the case with Luther's writings. There isn't a treatise on vocation, right? So he doesn't have here are my 95 theses on the doctrine of vocation, and here's what I mean by the doctrine of vocation. Luther is not a systematic theologian. He doesn't write dogmatics, theological handbooks where he just outlines doctrine. Instead, he responds occasionally to things that are happening. So he's dealing with what arises in the occasion. But this doctrine of vocation is one that really shows up throughout Luther's writings. It's something that is from the 1520s all the way to the end of his life. It shows up in sermons. It shows up when he's dealing with political issues specifically. It shows up in various theological lectures. It's interspersed throughout all of his writings. So because of that, it might be hard for somebody who wants to look at what Luther says about these things to really find some treatise they can look at. If you want to see Luther's basic approach to the Christian life, what does the Christian life look like? I could say, go look at On Christian Liberty. That's a really great text that outlines that. If you want to look at his doctrine of baptism or Holy Communion, we've got very specific treatises on those things I can point you to, but not quite the case with the doctrine of vocation. You can't even do it with justification, as weird as that is. That's just one of those things that just shows up everywhere, but he doesn't write. He had a plan to write a lengthier treatment of just the doctrine of justification at some point, but didn't do it. So this is a good overview of Luther if you do want to just go to one place. Now, let's talk about vocation and vocatio, what that means. Vocatio means a calling, right? So vocation is a calling. And so when people like Weber are talking about Luther's doctrine of vocation or idea of a calling, they're right in that Luther does speak about one's job as a calling. However, when Luther says vocatio or vocation, he is not only or even primarily speaking about your job, what you do to make money. And so Luther can speak about vocation in two ways. We've got the heavenly calling, and then we've got your earthly calling, your earthly vocation. But it's not a single earthly vocation. It's actually earthly vocations. And so you have a divine calling, and then you have earthly callings. So the divine calling is what we usually talk about in systematic theology as the doctrine of the call, or the vocatio. This is part of the ordo salutis, or the order of salvation. The call is the reality that through the Word of God, through the means of grace, the Holy Spirit invites people to himself and works faith. That is the call. So there's debates between Lutheran and the Reformed on this, where the Reformed you distinguish between an external and an internal call, or effectual call. The Lutherans say every call is a well-intentioned call. But the calling that is the heavenly calling is the calling unto salvation. That's the most important part here to understand. Earthly calling is something very different, because it is not about one's salvation. Salvation is a gift that is given by means of the Holy Spirit, who creates faith. We trust in Christ, who forgives our sins, who satisfied God's justice, satisfied the demands of the law on our behalf on the cross in his life, death, and resurrection. So that all is a gift given to us in faith, delivered by means of the Word of God and the holy sacraments of holy baptism, and then the Eucharist. But then we have these earthly vocations, these earthly callings. And your earthly calling is not about your salvation, but it is about service. And so the question is, okay, if baptism delivers all of the benefits of Christ to me, if I am united to Christ in my baptism, if I am united to his death and resurrection, if I am buried with Christ in baptism, as St. Paul says. If all of that is true, then why doesn't God just, rapture me into heaven? Like, why isn't it just, you're baptized, you're good, you're done? Because all you're going to do is like screw up the perfection that God's given you, right? You're going to sin, you're going to deal with all of these other issues. So you might as well just be done there. Well, God doesn't do that, right? He doesn't zap you into heaven. Because he has you here on this earth, not just for heavenly purposes, but also for earthly purposes. And so God has given us a life to live so that we can use that life to bless and serve the people around us. This is what Luther refers to as active righteousness, or sometimes we refer to as righteousness that is a coram mundo, or before the world, which is distinguished from coram deo righteousness, which is righteousness before God. The idea is that coram deo righteousness, or righteousness before God, is a gift. This is accomplished by Christ through his satisfaction, his work. And then there is this righteousness in the world, or righteousness before others, that we are called to enact as God's people in this world, not for the sake of meriting our justification. Christ already did that. We can't do that. But for the sake of serving our neighbor, for the sake of benefiting the people around us in this world. And so we do have a series of callings in this world. And those callings are divine callings. They are callings that are from God. Luther does not have a very strong sacred secular divide. Now he talks about, he will use the term secular, but the way that the term secular is translated in the 16th century is very different than the way that we mean it today, because it doesn't mean non-religious. It doesn't mean disconnected from faith or from theological claims. Secular simply means that which is not directly related to the gospel. So secular would be that which is related to the law, or related to God's commandments, rather than the promise of the forgiveness of sins in Christ, which is the gospel. And so we can talk about the secular sphere, but the secular sphere is really all about serving God by obeying his law and serving the neighbor. So it's not divorced from your faith in the way that we tend to use the term secular today. So there is no very strong sacred secular divide in Luther, and he does see that there is an issue when there is this strong sacred and secular divide, which he would say is what happens in the Middle Ages, is that there is this understanding that those who really want to dedicate their lives to service to God have to do it, or can only do it, by means of taking a monastic vow. And so these vows are the real way that you get close to God. And this shows up in the language that Luther is highly critical of, and rightly critical of, that the taking of vows is a second baptism. And for Luther, the New Testament doesn't do this. The New Testament didn't make this divide between those who are baptized and those who have received some extra grace on top of baptism. And that's not to say that there is no distinction between clergy and laity. There is clearly a distinction between clergy and laity. But the question is, can you only truly serve God in this special way through the pastoral office? Or can Christians who are just as dedicated and just as faithful also serve God with gifts and talents that are different than that, because God has just made them differently? And this giving of a kind of sacramental, baptismal validity to the taking of monastic vows really makes this huge sacred secular divide, so that there are those over here who are those who are in holy vocations, and then there's everybody else who's just doing the normal stuff. And at least some speak about these counsels of perfection, that there are these commands, like the Sermon on the Mount, for example, was taught by some in the medieval period, that those commandments are only for those who take monastic orders, those who take a vow of poverty, chastity, obedience. so that even some of the commands in the New Testament don't even relate to regular Christians, because you're just doing your regular stuff. You're just one of those kind of secular types. And so there is this huge secular sacred divide in the medieval period, which is not a good one. And Luther tries to break that down. And Luther tries to break that down not by destroying the sacred. So, like when you talk about Luther's relationship to monasticism, for example, one approach to this would just say, look, the early Lutherans, they just got rid of their monastic heritage. They just said monasticism is bad. We're going to focus on just like earthly callings, and that's it. And this kind of monastic piety basically has no place at all. And that's not what the Reformation does. Instead, there is a kind of democratization of monastic piety, in that monastic piety is brought out of the monastery into the home. Now, to be clear, there are some monasteries that continued after the Reformation that were Lutheran monasteries. So it's not like there was a forced dissolution of monasteries or something. But the more important thing is that monastic piety was brought into the home. So now we have family worship. Now we say those practices of prayer and meditation can be incorporated into the life of the average person. They are not just to be isolated into the monastery. And so we bring it into our regular lives. And so really there is this kind of infusion of the sacred within the Reformation into the ordinary, so that ordinary life itself becomes sacred. This doesn't mean there is no distinction at all between going to Mass and just being at home with your family. They're obviously distinct. This does not mean to say that everybody can be a pastor. There's no difference between clergy and laity. None of that is the case. But it is the case to say that you can serve God in holiness and do holy things and holy acts as an average person without taking on this one particular unique style of life or particular calling. And so when Luther talks about earthly callings, then he does want to say that this is, and these are, places where God has called you, and your earthly callings are ways to serve your neighbor. And so, yes, they are holy. Now, the way that people like Brian Holdsworth in his video portray this is as if this is a bad thing, like as if it's a bad thing to say that your work can also be holy in an act of service, such that your work has to be only for the purpose of doing something that actually is holy. So it's like, okay, well, you got to do your work, you got to do all this stuff, but like really what really matters is your family. And I think that is such a sad way to look at your work life, especially in our context where you are working a lot. And maybe it's different for me because like I'm doing things related to theology, so, and I work for the church and I'm ordained. And so maybe my work is holy, but Luther would say when he's talking to like the baker, don't just go to work when you are baking and just making bread, right? And just think like, okay, well, I'm making bread because I really need this money. I don't want to be here today, but I have to do it for the sake of my family. I got to feed them, Like that's such a miserable way to look at work. But what if instead of that you say, God is using me to feed the world? And one of the things that I'm called to do is to make sure that the one who is hungry is fed. Jesus talks about this in the Last Judgment, right? And so I need to feed the hungry. Well, what if God is using me to feed the hungry? Because I'm a baker. This is what I do. This is the calling God's given me. This is what I'm good at. This is what I'm doing day to day. And now there is meaning in your work. Now, like it matters because you're actually doing something meaningful with your life, because you are actually doing something that is holy and sacred. And it might seem like unimportant, but it's not. And so it does bring meaning to work. That's a good thing. Like, I don't know how you would see that as a negative. Of course, that's a good thing. Don't you want your work to be meaningful? Like, don't you want your work to be something that serves your neighbor? Don't you want your work to be a calling that God's given you? Now, callings for Luther, this vocatio, these callings, as I said, there are many callings. And so it's not just your job, but the callings are manifold. And a lot of these have to do with your position in your family. And so Luther talks about callings in a familial context much more often than he does in terms of work. He's most often talking about, like Luther has this doctrine of the three estates, the three different estates that God uses to rule the world. One of those is the church, one of those is the family, and then the other is the civic realm or politics. And that you have callings in each of these realms. Everybody has callings in each of those realms. But take your family, and none of those are jobs, unless you're a politician, of course, or clergy. But take your family. In your family, you have a series of different vocations. So, like I am a husband, and so I have a vocation. I have a calling as a husband. That is a holy calling to be a husband. And there are certain duties and obligations that align with what that calling is. I also have a calling to be a father. And in being a father to my two boys, I have different callings and obligations. My role is distinct there. I am a son, right? And to my parents, I also have distinct callings and obligations. So these are all, and I'm a brother, these are all distinct callings. They all have distinct duties. They all have distinct responsibilities, so that I am to act differently within each of those relationships. But I need to see those relationships as callings, as vocations, as callings that are given by God. Now, the family callings clearly show that what Luther is not just talking about is some like this calling that is just the thing you're doing to make money. It's completely missing the point, because none of it has anything to do with making money. And none of this for Luther is about these being like signs that you have attained grace. Luther doesn't have this issue, because Luther is sacramental. And so we have the sacraments. We don't need these other signs from here or there that Weber's talking about, which is where he's really talking about Calvinism. And I'm not going to say Weber's accurate about Calvinism either, but just to say you really can't apply this to Luther. I'll let the Calvinists deal with the other part of it. So, but then we have other callings that would be within your civic obligations. And so you are a citizen, and as a citizen, you have certain duties. You have a duty to honor your superiors, which Luther talks about a lot. Luther is not, when he writes about vocation, it's very clear that he does not envision this kind of social mobility. He does not envision a society in which one can seek out their own calling. In fact, he regularly speaks about the fact that you don't choose your calling. It's given to you. And that's just kind of an assumption, is whatever your class is, it's just kind of given to you. You might be in a position, sure, you might be in a position where there is a level of social mobility. Maybe you do have the possibility of getting an education, as he did. He had the opportunity to study law or to study theology. You might be in that kind of position to make a choice. But by and large, the assumption is your path is kind of already laid out for you. Like your class is already there. Your family is your family. These aren't things that you can really change. And so a lot of what Luther says about vocation is really about contentment, and contentment in your own position, and recognizing that your position, whatever it might be, is a calling, and that you need to serve your neighbor in whatever unique ways you are called to in this position. And so it's never about finding a calling. That's completely the opposite of Luther's point, which is where we've really gone wrong today in our society, is that there is this idea that everybody does have this unique set of skills, and you need this kind of unique, specific job that's really going to fulfill you specifically. And so there's all this anxiety around what you're going to do, and there's all this anxiety about what you're going to do in college and what you're going to major in, and then if you're in college, anxiety about what internship you're going to get or what school you're going to get into for grad school, because then all your plans could be totally ruined if it doesn't work out exactly the way that you want. And then what if you're working and you're like, this doesn't feel fulfilling? Well, maybe you have a different calling, and then you got to go change jobs, and you're bouncing from here to here to here to here, and you move to 10 different cities in 20 years because you're trying to look for some fulfilling job that's going to make you feel good. That's not at all what Luther's talking about. That's like the opposite of what Luther's talking about, because none of it's about personal fulfillment, and none of it's about me picking anything. The point is, wherever you are right now, look around you and say, okay, What are the responsibilities that have been given to me, and then how can I fulfill those responsibilities in a way that honors God and serves my neighbor? That's the question of calling or vocation. So a lot of this is political. He does talk a lot about politics. He talks a lot about the magistrate and the role of the magistrate, to say that the political estate is something that is holy. It is good. It's not the same as the priestly office or something, but it is a good thing, and you can serve God in and through the political estate if that's where you have been called, because God also governs the political estate. God governs the church, God governs the state. He governs all things. And so you can serve God in holy places in all of those things, though they always remain fundamentally and essentially distinct. All right. So then we've got your calling within the family. We have your calling then in the political or civic realm. And then we have your calling within the church. And within the church, of course, there is a distinction between the pastoral office and the one who is not called to the pastoral office. So Luther doesn't get rid of the distinction between clergy and laity. In fact, Luther is extremely harsh toward the Anabaptists who do exactly that. And so the pastoral office is a God-ordained office. It is a holy one. However, there are no grounds for saying that this is some kind of a second baptism. Because really, before God, our righteousness before God is the same. Because before God, they're just the baptized. That determines my right relation to God, is that I am united to Christ's death and resurrection, and that is a gift given through holy baptism. And so the office of the holy ministry does not merit something before God, right? It does not give me some kind of additional righteousness before God. But it is certainly a holy calling, and those who are called to the office of the holy ministry do become the instruments whereby God brings his word and his sacraments to the world. So it certainly is a sacred calling. But note that in those three estates, as I said, there is no focus on jobs. Making money is not part of this at all. Like, that's not even really part of Luther's idea of vocation. It doesn't really play into it. So he does speak about the things you're doing in your job. So he could talk about things like, like the baker, or like the maid, or whatever else it might be. But it's not really monetary. So in terms of this whole thesis, part of the argument that has defended the thesis, or the arguments that's been put forth to defend the thesis, is that after the Reformation, when you look at Protestant countries versus Roman Catholic countries, the Protestant countries tended to, by and large, make more money. Like, they tended to have more innovation. And I think that's probably a point in favor of Protestantism. I don't think that's not a bad thing. And why is that the case? Well, Protestants tended to focus on things like education, educating the laity. Luther was really influential in helping to create the modern school system, though he's not the only part of that story, of course. Protestants praised literacy and wanted people to actually read the Bible for themselves. And yes, it is true that when you do start to recognize your job or everything in life as something that is holy and something that you can use to serve the neighbor, it does become less like a monotonous thing you are doing for the sake of some other purpose. And instead, it does become something that you can actually enjoy and delight in. But does that necessarily lead to overwork? Does it lead to dismissing the family, the centrality of the church in society? I don't think any of those things are true at all. Those things are really due to all sorts of other factors, and factors that have to do with secularization more than anything else. I don't think like the Industrial Revolution was caused by Protestantism. These are technological advances that I think, kind of exist really apart from theological considerations at all. And yeah, you can do the whole, domino effect kind of thing, that this led to this, led to this, led to this, led to this. And okay, if you want to like play that kind of game, I mean, maybe you could say that Luther played some role in something, but that also means that you're giving Luther all of the credit for all of the good things that came about, like all of the advancements in positive ways that happened in society as well. But there's a heck of a lot more to it than just theological considerations. So, well, I hope you found this helpful. This was a pretty brief overview. There's a lot to say in terms of Luther's doctrine of vocation, but hopefully it gives you a little bit more context, a little bit more of an idea of what this whole idea of the Protestant work ethic is really all about, and whether it has anything to do with Luther at all. So thanks so much for watching and or listening, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.